1, 2, 3, yeah! This is Amari Purple Talk. Yes. Welcome to episode 94 of Amari Purple Talk, a podcast where I share my thoughts on the Prince musical singularity. I'm Richard Cole, Imaginationist, comic book myth builder, and the Vic Sage of Funk. Thank you once again for tuning in. Please leave your comments in the comments section below, and please download on your favorite podcast platform. If you're listening on YouTube, please like and subscribe. And please continue to send your questions or topic suggestions for Amari Purple Talk. And how you can do that, you may ask, is by clicking the link in the show notes below, either the website link for Amari Communications, or by following me on Twitter at RichardCole_now. Please use the hashtag Amari Purple Talk, and your topic or question might just be read in a future episode. All right, so let's get to it. So starting off, once again, folks, coming June 28th through July 29th will be a brand new Prince Twitter head with the moderators Edgar Cruz and DJ UMB. Once again, I've been asked to take a part in this, and thank you once again for having me participate. This subject will be on the Jill Jones album, the solo album on Paisley Park Records, the classic. So we will be discussing every track throughout this Prince Twitter thread. And as an extra bonus, we will have on July 29th the VIP thread by none other than the lady herself, Jill Jones. So follow that hashtag Prince Twitter thread. And again, that is starting on June 28th. With an introduction by DJ UMB. So check that out. My contribution will be on the B-side, 77 Bleecker Street. That will be on July 7th. So definitely check it out. And of course, I'll remind you each and every week of who will be participating, as well as the tracks that contributor will discuss. This album is a deep favorite of mine, going all the way back to summer of 1987. I mean, Sign of the Times album was still dominating my cassette deck. Also, Madhouse, that was also dominating my cassette deck at that time. And it just when you thought it couldn't get any better, we find Jill Jones in the record store, prominently displayed, and was like, yep, got to pick that album up, pick that up. And that also, too, dominated my cassette deck. Also, later, dominated my CD player. And now it is dominating my various USB drives, and I got to hunt down a copy of the vinyl somewhere if it's still around, especially now with the release of Dwayne Tudor's book, The Parade and Sign of the Times era studio sessions, 1985 to 1986. A lot during that period Most of the Jill Jones, the actual album itself, was completed during that time frame. A couple of B-sides, of course, were recorded probably during 1987, but that would be a topic for another book. But just, reading the anecdotes and the stories and the recollections about how that album was put together, brought back some memories, so I had to listen to those tracks once again. And again, like I said, I now want to hunt down the vinyl for it. So, but yes, definitely tune in to the Prince Twitter thread and check it out. So now with that out of the way, we're going to dive into our topic for today. As far as Twitter questions, submitted questions to or through my website, amaricommunications.com. Don't feel like I didn't check them out. I have. I know I did say we were going to do those this week. Actually going to do that next week, because this week it's the anniversary of the release of not only the Batman soundtrack, but the classic 1989 Batman film with Michael Keaton. We'll talk about a lot of my reflections and memories of watching that movie, bumping the soundtrack, seeing it get a lot of traction on social media throughout the Prince musical singularity this year. To me, it's a dope album. It sounds great. Again, that we talked about summer of '87, Sign of the Times, Jill Jones, Madhouse, but hey, summer of '89, for me, that was dominated by the Batman soundtrack, and I enjoyed it. To me, I felt like some of the songs could have been placed better in the film, but we'll talk about that in a few too. But I liked it, even some of the filler songs. And, a lot of people say that it's not Prince's best album, or to others, it's sort of like the beginning of the end. From a commercial standpoint, I felt like, yeah, this is what he needed to stay on top. But again, you have to look at it this way. This was a soundtrack for a film. This movie, just like, say, Jaws or Star Wars back in the 70s, changed the way we go to the movies and how we spend our summers at the movies. This film elevated that even more. Kind of one of the foundations, say maybe along with Christopher Reeve, the first two Superman movies. This set the stage for what we were able to get decades later. You kids are spoiled. Big time spoiled. I won't go into the stuff that we got for TV shows and movies regarding superheroes. The first two Superman movies, the first two Batman movies with Michael Keaton, directed by Tim Burton, those were sort of the gold standard. Anything else in between, like I said, that's another topic for a different type of a show. But I wish I could go back in those days, say 1978, get 12-year-old me, go back to even 1989 and get 23-year-old me, and just sit down and be like, look, MCU, check this out. I would probably be comatose or need a nap if my younger self would have witnessed that. But like I said, I enjoyed this soundtrack a lot. And, there's a lot of symmetry when it comes to Prince and Batman. and a lot of stuff that has come to light in regards to how comics influence certain things in Prince songs. And that's what we're going to start off with this episode, in acknowledging the Batman soundtrack and Prince's involvement with Batman that began at a very early age. And we're going to start with the Batman, who he is and how he came to be. And Batman was created in 1939 by Bob Kane and Bill Finger. Bob Kane initially came up with the whole concept of the Batman, but it was Bill Finger, who was a writer at DC Comics, that really helped Bob Kane shape Batman into how we see Batman today. And, you know, with maybe the darker colors with the cape and the cowl, but he also introduced the Joker, he introduced the Batmobile. You know, a lot of the touches that made Batman a very successful comic book. And Bill Finger didn't get the credit until really just a few years ago, right around the time of the release of the Batman versus Superman film in 2016. There were people that were championing for him to get the credit for that, and, you know, some of the money that's due with creating it. Again, you know, we're talking about artist rights. Again, something that Prince championed not only for his own career, but also other musical artists. Same thing goes with a lot of these comic book creators too, especially of the classic characters. Jerry Siegel, Joe Shuster, you know, created Superman and benefited from some of the success, but then after a while was cut off from some of that success. And it wasn't until right around the 70s that they started getting that acknowledgement again. Jack Kirby's another one. We all know Stan Lee, but for those of you that don't necessarily read comics or that were in depth into comics, you know, Jack Kirby was the artist and helped Stan Lee create the Fantastic Four, the Incredible Hulk, the X-Men. God, there's so many. The Silver Surfer, you name it. Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, they were the Lennon and McCartney of comic books, coming up right around the same time. Marvel in the 60s, Beatles in the 60s. And also in the 60s was the Batman TV show, starring Adam West as Batman, Burt Ward as Robin. And the theme song for the Batman TV show was written by Neil Hefti. And not only is he famous for the Batman theme song, but he's also noted for soundtracks like Barefoot in the Park and the movie version of The Odd Couple, in which the main theme from that was also used for the Odd Couple TV show. So if you go on any one of the streaming services, you can definitely check out Neil Hefti's work, not only those soundtracks, but there is an album compilation of Batman music, the theme song for the TV show, and some other things inspired by the TV show. I think that might have been used for that. But another key factor in sort of musical inspiration was also Nelson Riddle, another major film composer. Check out a lot of his work. And while we're on the subject of Prince symmetry, if you want to check out Nelson Riddle's work, he also did the soundtrack for the film Lolita. Sound familiar, folks? Yeah, sure it does. And we all know what a big film buff Prince was. I'm sure he's seen that movie. So I haven't seen it, but I might have to check it out. But yeah, definitely to check out both Neil Hefti and Nelson Riddle's work. By all means, check it out, because check this out. A lot of us in the Prince musical singularity already know, but the very first song Prince learned to play on the piano was the Batman TV show. So a little later on in the show, I'm going to talk about how those two key composers and their work on the Batman TV show had some influence on Prince in some of the music that you might be familiar with. So again, we'll come back to that. But as far as Batman as a comic book character, or comic books in general, appears that what we've learned lately is that they had a big influence on Prince and some of his concepts, and even some of the songs as well. So I'm going to start off by talking about a comic book writer, artist that changed the game for comic books in the 80s, and whose work has been very influential on how not only Batman and how he's been portrayed in comic books and movies all the way up till now, but comic book movies in general. You know, Stan Lee and Marvel changed the game with comics, because before, comics were just pretty much, you know, good versus evil, and were pretty much aimed at a certain demographic, mainly for children. Now, mainly during World War II, soldiers got into comic books because it was just a little bit of slice from home, you know, to kind of escape the realities of combat and the realities of war. You know, it was just kind of like a stress reliever, you know. But after World War II, sales kind of declined. And also in the 50s, there was sort of this movement that was blaming comic books on everything from, you know, juvenile delinquency to teen pregnancy to devil worship, you name it. You know, it just got this bad rap to it. But by the 60s, when Stan Lee created the Fantastic Four, he wanted to do his own thing. You know, he wanted to write the kind of comic book that he wanted to write. And what he wanted to do was sort of put superheroes in a normal setting. You know, instead of making up a Gotham City or Metropolis, most of the heroes live right there in New York City, and they all had real world problems. You know, not everybody was a millionaire like Bruce Wayne, you know, like Spider-Man. How was he going to pay the rent? Catch a cold or catch an allergy attack in the middle of a fight? You know, how was Peter going to get a girlfriend? Things like that. So by the 1980s, along comes Frank Miller. And Frank Miller took over the writing and the art of Marvel's Daredevil comic book. Daredevil was created in 1964 by Stan Lee. But in 1981, Frank Miller elevated the character to superstar status, you know, to kind of like to the level of Spider-Man and Batman. That's how popular that comic became in the 80s. Relative to the success that Chris Claremont and John Byrne, when they were doing the X-Men, and Marv Wolfman and George Perez and their run on the New Teen Titans in the 80s. You know, for for me, my first comic when I was a kid was Fantastic Four. It was King Size Special #1, which was a reprint of Fantastic Four Annual #1. That was first printed in the 60s. The King Size Special came out in like 70. So I was like 4. And this is like my very first comic book. And I think maybe after that I got exposed to Batman. There was a barbershop right around the corner from my house. And sort of like in the beginning, my dad would take me there to get my hair cut. And at that time, they would have magazines there. But this barbershop also had comic books. And there was Batman, and I think there was Daredevil as well. And I don't remember having seen the Batman TV show yet. So here we are, like maybe about this time, maybe 5, roughly about 4 or 5, kind of around this same time. And, checking out Batman. And it was different from the TV show. Like I said, I don't remember seeing the TV show yet. That came for me in 2nd grade. And that was the period where it was like, I think, school let out at like 2:55. And Batman would be on at 3 o'clock. Channel 30, KDNL, St. Louis. And, soon as that bell rang, we all would just sprint home and, make it home pretty much just in time for the, just in time for that. And we didn't have a color TV, but who cared? That was life in the early 70s. And still, the whole pow, bang, splat, that was still cool. Years later, it was kind of, you realize it was campy. But there was a reason for that. Originally, it was going to be kind of a serious take. But I guess the networks felt, people were bogged down with everything that they were seeing in the news. Primarily what was going on with the Vietnam War. So they felt like they needed something lighthearted to kind of mellow people out. I mean, to me, I think people were smarter than that then, but it still worked. It was a successful show. But by the time the 70s rolled around, it had been canceled, but syndication, it took off and was very popular. So it was able to grab, like I said, when I started seeing it in 2nd grade, so we were the generation, or maybe the first generation, to kind of benefit from the reruns of it. And, Prince was probably checking out the show whenever he learned it on piano. He was probably checking out the show in real time. But, like I said, just during that time and seeing the TV show and the campiness, but having read, or seen some of the comic books from the early 70s, what I didn't realize at the time, there was this, sort of movement to move Batman away from the stigma of the TV show. Because originally, when he was created, he was the kind of like what you see in Batman movies now, or Batman comic books now. Especially before there was a Robin that was created. The stories were kind of a little dark. Then they kind of created Robin to kind of, again, mellow folks out, or, give the kids somebody to kind of identify with. It's like, you want to grow up and be a rich millionaire and be Bruce Wayne and be Batman. But, while you're 8 years old, hey, great, now you can be Robin. So that was the logic behind, Robin's creation. And the Joker originally wasn't like he was in the TV show when they first created him. I remember getting a reprint of the very first Batman comic. And, reading that first story was like, first story with the Joker was like, whoa, because he was nothing like he was on the TV show. He was hardcore. He was straight up killing folks right and left in that first issue. And that was heavy. He kind of what you saw in Christopher Nolan's The Dark Knight, how he was taking people out, kind of announcing it, the whole, or even the original 1989 Batman, where he would get on the TV and sort of use the media to showcase, his crimes. That's all from that very first issue. And that was an eye opener. It was like, it didn't like scare me like, oh my God, I can't sleep at night. But it was just like, whoa, this is different than the TV show. And I think I like this version of the Joker better. And kind of, again, once you got into the 40s, especially the 1950s, that was sort of that corniness and that campiness and, kind of watering things down to by the time you got to the TV show, it started to become a reflection of a lot of that. So with all the kookiness and the corniness and stuff. But by the early 70s, they would like, let's go back to what people originally had on this character, the world's greatest detective. The dirty, dark, mean streets of Gotham City and, the obsessively driven crime fighter and the broodiness and all of that. But Frank Miller, with both Daredevil and later on with Batman, even took that and bumped it up a whole bunch of notches. So with Daredevil, one of the things that he added to his run was the creation of a character named Elektra. And she was this assassin. And Frank Miller's logic was that, well, how come superheroes always go for, these normal girls and the damsels in distress? These are superheroes. And they would want to kind of gravitate towards oh, cool. That was thunder. All right. But they would gravitate towards, other super type beings. So that was his logic in creating Elektra, to kind of create a sort of a relationship, with the tension being that she's an assassin, but they have this deep love affair. And kind of similar to with Batman and Catwoman. They kind of had that dynamic first, but Frank Miller thought he would introduce that, or maybe having been influenced by that dynamic, included in Daredevil as well. So, but the name Elektra, like I said, we'll get to that influence on Prince in a second. Or actually, no. Actually, my notes say I should actually tackle that right now. So, what we're going to do is get into spoilers for Dwayne Tudhal's book. So, if you haven't read it yet, just kind of remember where you were at this point in the episode. And then after you've had a chance to really read it, come back, if you don't like things being spoiled. But other than that, we are going to get into spoilers. So I'm going to get my copy of Dwayne Tudhal's book. And I am going to go to Friday, November 14th of 1986. And what was worked on that day was Come Elektra Tuesday, which is the extended version. And it was done at Sunset Sound. And this was a track for the quote-unquote collectors out there. You've heard the Prince version, or what we now call the Prince originals. But apparently this song was intended or considered for inclusion on Jill Jones's album. So here's a quote by Jill Jones in this book where she says, "My name was supposed to be Elektra Assassin. I actually was like, no, what's wrong with Jill Jones? He was always trying to improve me and make me something else. It was weird. Okay, and then, so from there it says Prince worked on an extended mix of Come Electra Tuesday for Jill Jones, possibly because he was pushing for her to change her name to Electra. Because the lyrics were drafted from a male perspective, it would require some rewriting to fit her. Now, Prince was a big fan of the, and in quotes, or parentheses, I'm sorry, Frank Miller created comic book character Electra and had written a song called Come Electra Tuesday that he wanted me to sing, remember Jill. His manager, Steve Fargnoli, came to my rescue and told Prince I was already established as a singer, so I didn't have to change my name. All right, so what's interesting is that at some point, Prince read Daredevil. So we already got the Batman influence, and he's been reading Daredevil in the 80s. Now, my first question is, okay, I get it. As kids, we've all encountered a comic book. And some of us have encountered comic books deeper than others. And I mean, I remember, starting off as a kid, there weren't really comic shops in those days. You just basically had to get a comic book from wherever you could get one, usually like from a drugstore, like a local drugstore. I think 7-Eleven had them at one point. Just wherever you found yourself in the position of comics. Actually, my first comic, I can't remember which, I don't know if it was, maybe if I was with my grandmother or whoever, but there used to be little machines, kind of like, not machines, but these little boxes, like you used to be able to get newspapers out of them. You used to like put a quarter in or whatever amount of money in to get like the daily paper or the weekend paper. But quiet as it's kept, they were very easy to break into, folks. But you didn't hear that from me. But anyway, they used to have them back then, but I guess because they were so easy to break into, they stopped having them. But they used to have them for comic books too. There used to be these little red boxes, and they would have comics. The same thing. You put like whatever they cost back then, 12 cents, dime, quarter, drop it in, and you get the comic book out of this box. So, like I said, you just got what you got. So if you had issue 12 of a comic book, then by the time you got to a place where you could get a comic book again, then the only thing you could get would be issue 14. Or a couple of years would go by and it's like, well, I've got 12 and 14 and here's issue 32 now, And maybe you could catch up. Like we all used to sneak comics to school and would trade off. And, when you're supposed to be reading the textbook, we'd have the comic book kind of whatever. Or sometimes if we were good enough to have sort of quiet time or reading time, then you could just sit and read whatever you wanted. And, we trade off these comics and, oftentimes, hell, comics that other people had were cooler than the ones that I had. Maybe other people felt the same about mine, but that's how it was. And then I know for me, kind of once I got to 13, 14, I had kind of stopped because I just kind of felt like, oh, I'm getting older now and comics aren't blah, 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 blah. Until I walked into this place that I used to get comic books all the time. Like by the time I was 12, I found a place. It wasn't a comic shop, but they had comics and they had enough of them. And it was a place I could get to and was able to get them on a regular basis. So now here I am able to get, every month, Spider-Man, Fantastic Four, Avengers, whatever. And, kind of spend some of my allowance on that. So anyway, so I go in just to kind of, like just nostalgia, because it was at this point, it's high school, and sometimes occasionally, like after school, I would just hop the bus and just go downtown and just hang out downtown for a little bit and just come home. And like I said, just kind of stopped in there, just kind of on this nostalgia trip, and just kind of seeing how much comics had changed since the last time I had picked one up. And there was the new Teen Titans, issue number 17, written by Marv Wolfman, drawn by George Perez. And George Perez was one of my favorite comic book artists back then. And I was like, oh, they're doing Teen Titans now? And I'm looking through, and it's like, hey, it's George Perez art. I can't ignore it. So, plop down my 50 cents for the comic book and read it and was like, damn, this is a pretty good story. And that was my gateway back into comics. And, still kind of had that thing to where like, well, girls aren't going to look at you because you're reading comic books. But, I just kind of developed this thing to where like, you know what? Comics are cool. I like them. I don't care who doesn't. And that's how it is. And how it always was. So that was it, because it's like, it's cool, and it's mythology. It's commercialized mythology, and it's cool, and should check it out and give it a shot. And now here we are many years later, and, thanks to things like Big Bang Theory and, the MCU and stuff like that, I think people have pretty much caught on that, yeah, it is cool to check out. So, so there's people like me that became like sort of collectors of comics. But it's like, did, Prince have some comic boxes up there in Paisley Park too? Or, was he just a casual reader and just happened upon, an issue of Daredevil one day and was like, oh, I like that name. But Elektra Assassin, I'm trying to remember, when did that? Yep, that was also like around, so right around the same time. Yeah, Frank Miller and Bill Sienkiewicz had a mini-series called Elektra Assassin, which focused on the Elektra character. And now I'm like, man, I wish I could have met Prince and talked to this brother about comics and, pick his brain on, what did he read? Was he a deep dive comic fan? Again, were there comic boxes in Paisley Park? Did he have the plastic and the backing boards? Hell, did he, he had some millions. Did he, was he able to get a near mint condition of Superman #1 or Batman #1? Did he sell a copy to Mark Hamill? Who knows? More thunder. Thunder all through the night. Okay, that's another episode for another day. All right, so getting back to our comic book sweaty episode of Amari Purple Talk here. So we have, once again, Frank Miller reinvents Batman in the 1980s with his series The Dark Knight Returns in 1986. And this comic book changed the game for the comic book industry. This one, along with Alan Moore's Watchmen. So if you're familiar with the Zack Snyder film, which is basically probably one of the best panel for panel adaptations of a comic book for a film, and also the Watchmen TV series that's on HBO, or you can watch it on HBO Max now. Those two comics in the 80s completely changed the game for the industry, opening the doors to, like I said, to the way that we perceive comic books, the way we perceive comic book movies, and what you can do with storytelling And like I said, just, taking the realism up a couple of notches, or using, say, pop culture references within society to kind of influence maybe a more darker narrative, and aiming this material at audiences other, or children have their own comics. We as adults, again, it's modern mythology, and the stories are just as engaging as any novel of any genre. But definitely with The Dark Knight Returns, written and drawn by Frank Miller, it was a 4-issue miniseries. This and later his 4-issue run within the Batman regular comic book series, this 4-part series called Batman Year One. Those two story arcs have influenced how Batman has been portrayed in comics and movies even to this day. So he basically went not only back to 1939, 1940 with the gritty, brooding, obsessively driven Batman crime fighter. There's elements of Dirty Harry. As we were reading Dark Knight Returns in those days, first voice that popped into our heads reading it was Clint Eastwood. So, hence the influence with, even with Michael Keaton, it's that, who are you? I'm Batman. That was sort of what we would hear in our heads reading Dark Knight Returns as Clint Eastwood, the whole, do you feel lucky, punk? That whole thing. And years prior to this, there had been talks as early as, say, 1981 of trying to get a Batman film off the ground, especially with the success of Superman 1 and Superman 2. Yeah, the next logical step for Warner Brothers would have been to do a Batman movie. And they had been trying for years to get that off the ground. And then finally they had all the pieces together, to which we now have the Tim Burton version. And if you have the Blu-ray of the 1989 Batman, there in the special features, when they talk about the soundtrack, it's a brief bit, and there's footage of Prince on set with Tim Burton, kind of walking around the Batman set. And it's just how we read it in wherever we read it, Rolling Stone or whatever magazine that was reporting that Prince was going to do the soundtrack, and how he was walking around, and when he left, he was like, yes, I hear music in these scenes. And that's what you see. You see that for just like a few brief seconds in the special features as they're talking about how they talked to Prince and, asked him to do the soundtrack for the film. I guess it's one of those, what they call those full circle moments. Here it is, the first song you learn in your journey to become the greatest musician on the planet. Your first song you learn is the Batman TV show theme. Here you are, the superstar of all superstars. And now you're being asked, because one of the co-stars of the film, Jack Nicholson, was a big Prince fan. They were using, kind of when you're planning or you're making the film and you have certain scenes where you're going to use a song, but it's going to be an original song, and that song hasn't been written yet, or you haven't found the person to write the song yet. So you just kind of just play music to kind of get the actors to go on with the scene. Like, okay, in this scene, this type of song is playing, and you're doing this and you're doing that. So those scenes where the Joker's in the museum and during the Gotham City Festival, they were using at first Baby I'm a Star in 1999. And I guess during that, Jack Nicklaus was like, well, hey, why don't you just go ahead and get Prince to write the soundtrack for it? And it was a great idea. And here you have Prince now writing the soundtrack. Originally, Warner Brothers basically forced him to take a year off because no matter how much we loved the Lovesexy album, there were people on the planet that didn't love it as much as we did. And from Warner Brothers' standpoint, they were like, yeah, you haven't sold units this low in a long time. Why don't you take a break? But, Prince being Prince, his break meant that, hey, he's just going to sit in Paisley Park and just crank out songs, which originally was going to end up being Raven to the Joy Fantastic. But here comes this opportunity to do the soundtrack, get a few extra bucks in your pocket and have an excuse to put an album out. And I think it worked. Every year like I said, because I enjoy this album, it's maybe not necessarily my top 5 album, because I'm, really try to stop thinking in those terms now, but it is a favorite of mine. I do enjoy playing it. When I put the CD on, or if I listen to it on streaming, yeah, it's because I enjoy those songs. I love The Future. I love Electric Chair. I love Vicky Waiting. Trust sounds good. Scandalous is great. Now, I do enjoy the Scandalous Sex Suite better, but before that even existed, Scandalous to me was an Adore class ballad. Lemon Crush. But again, like I said, every year as an episode. Not sure how much I can keep doing this episode every year, because I think this is just pretty much covering everything, unless someday there'll be a Batman Super Deluxe, or I wouldn't say Super Deluxe, but let's just say, let's just say a Batman Expanded Edition, because I see that's the trend now, these expanded editions where you just get maybe a remaster of the original album, but you will also get, whatever the singles that were released in extended versions, and that's it. No unreleased tracks, no vault stuff. At least in the case of Batman. I'm not saying that won't ever happen to Prince, but in the case of Batman, I think that's what we're going to end up with at some point. It's just, which is cool, because I wouldn't mind having, an official CD version of Fill You Up, the long version, or the long stroke. The Bat Dance mixes. I wouldn't mind having that on a CD, remastered. I would enjoy that quite a bit. But, like I said, unless there's some new development that comes along until that happens, like I said, I'm not sure how much every year I'll acknowledge this in the way that I have since this show started. But when I do this Batman episode, I dedicate it to 2 people that have been very influential on this show, and especially when it comes to this episode. And the first person is a friend of mine that had passed away, practically over 10 years ago. And he was the one, his name is John Rochester, the King Adi Rock. He was the one, back in the day, we used to sit around and talk about comics. And like I said, because we didn't have an MCU back then, and like I said, that time frame between Superman 1 and 2 and the 1989 Batman film, only thing we could do as comic book sweaties would be just to fan cast the films. And one day, this is about like 86, 87, and the subject of a Batman movie, like if you were to make a Batman movie at that time, what would it, what would it be? What would it look like? Who would you get? And, we would throw names out. Like, I think we agreed, like, Harrison Ford as Batman. Maybe a younger Michael J. Fox, or maybe Michael J. Fox can just get away with playing Robin. But it was John Rochester that predicted the Batman movie that we would get in 1989. And he was like, yeah, that's all cool. But first, you got to get rid of that gray suit with the powder blue cape and cowl. Get rid of that. Now, the only reason that existed just is because of the dynamics of how ink and color was done in those days. Nowadays you have the color palettes, you have the computers, the printing processes, that can make, that allows you to do any color you want that you can imagine onto a printed page. So things would get swapped out for, black would be substituted by either like indigo blue or just blue. That's why when you would see, say, like a Superman comic, yeah, most of the hair would be black, but then there'd be this blue highlight, because the colors wouldn't translate well to hair texture and things of that nature. And then you also had like really racist things that would happen. Like, Asian people would be this really weird yellow. Black people would be like gray and stuff, but nowadays you don't have that. Like I said, nowadays you have the technology to put whatever color you want onto a printed page and have it realistic and have it believable and things of that nature. So hence the powder blue cape and cowl type of thing. So he was like, get rid of that. The costume should be all black and it should be body armor, because you out there, you fighting crime. Cat shoots at you. That's it. You ain't Superman. You ain't bulletproof. Now, the logic was when Frank Miller was doing it, and I think other creators kind of like 70s, early mid 70s, kind of used the logic that he had a bulletproof vest underneath, but it was still cloth material. And then later on, that cloth material had a layer of Kevlar or whatever, But full body armor, that was the revolution, right there. And he came up with that. And the Joker should be Jack Nicholson. And we were like, yeah, yep. All right, yep, okay, cool. And Prince should do the soundtrack. Yeah, okay. Yeah. He predicted that. And, it's interesting because I'm going to just cap that off with, again, going back to the Batman TV show, the theme song being the first thing that Prince learned to play. Obviously he watched the Batman TV show, and that was some swinging music. That was some really swinging music. Um, and like the fight scene, sometimes, with them in the Batmobile driving around. One of my favorite themes too was the Batgirl theme. When she came along, I think like in the second or third season, and then she's on her bike, and then they have the Batgirl theme playing while she's riding. Tell me, now get this, if you listen to Let's Go Crazy, the extended version, the version that you see in Purple Rain, and when they kind of just go into that little musical vamp, kind of like right after the bridge, and that whole, let's see, that jink 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 clack jink 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 clack jink jink da 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 da. Tell me that is not influenced by, like whatever Batman and Robin were doing, like the fight scenes, or like I said, they racing in the Batmobile, or Batgirl on her bike, riding to the crime scene. Tell me he wasn't influenced by that. And I'm gonna give you another track too. When it breaks down, it's new wave as hell, but when it really breaks down, when it starts, when basically I'm gonna give you a hint. When it gets slower, tell me when it slows down, you don't think of the Batman TV show for a minute, and that's Ooh She She Wah Wah, the Apollonia 6 track. Like I said, it starts off as typical new wave, but even that little bass line, no, that could have fit in a fight scene on any episode of the Batman TV show. Pow, biff, splat, slower. My name is Uta. Tell me that Batman influence doesn't creep in there somewhere, somehow. I mean, I'm sure there's other tracks too. I have to dig deep. If you can think of one in which you might think that, I'll say maybe I'll give you maybe some of the Madhouse stuff, not the first one, but maybe to a certain extent the second one, Madhouse 16, that album. There might be a little bit of it, not as much. But to me, that Madhouse album kind of it doesn't sound exactly like it, but the tone reminds me more of the 1967 Spider-Man animated series, in which that music, like the first season of that music was composed and orchestrated by a composer by the name of Ray Ellis. Now, it's hard to find anything recorded by him in regards to that series, but you can find things by other musicians. I can't think of what this was. It was some record label that had this collective of like these jazz musicians, and kind of doing that sort of, beginning of fusion type, that fusion type jazz from kind of like the late 60s on. Some of that you can find maybe on some of the streaming services, but a lot of the Ray Ellis stuff, there's fans of that animated series that make little compilations or able to rip the audio from, the film or the cartoon or whatever, and have kind of made their own compilations. But that was some swinging stuff. You kind of nowadays with a lot of these animated shows, you get this cheesy. To me, it sounds more like just no different than a commercial jingle, really. And it's like, come on, we were kids and this stuff was hip. And you can give kids something hip too, well, Into the Spider-Verse, though. That's some hip stuff, though. Now that is a soundtrack, Into the Spider-Verse. But again, getting back to the music that influenced Prince, if there are songs that you can think of to where some of that Batman TV show influence might kind of rear its head every now and then, leave me a comment and let me know. But I also want to finish this up with the second influence on this show. And that is another gentleman that had passed away a couple of years ago. Both of these cats gone way, way, way too soon. Where John Rochester, very close friend of mine, like brother almost. And, to have him not around, to have his jokes, to have him, if something happened in your life that cracked him up, you would get this off the top of the dome dance hall reggae, take on what just happened to you. That type of thing. But the second person is somebody that I've never met in person, but I've watched on his show on YouTube. He came through this collective with John Campia, all that AMC stuff, and then later with Collider. But it was John Schnepp, and he did a comic book show on YouTube. That, like I said, started with AMC, then everything switched over to Collider. And like I said, another cat gone too soon. But like I said, his knowledge of comics, just his world view, that was very influential, and especially with where I'm in a position to where it's not as easy for me to kind of, dialogue with a lot of my brothers about certain things, whether it's comic books, comic book movies, Prince music in general. There were these shows that I could watch in my spare time, or like I said, while everybody else is out of pocket, and a thing to where if I'm at work, they're at home. If they're at home, I'm at work. So that time that I have, that downtime, like I said, not with the luxury of being able to really truly dialogue like I want to, then there were these shows, these podcasts, like I said, with his show, later on with a lot of the Prince shows, the, Podcast Juice and Prince's Friend, and watching a lot of those, it was like kind of being able to dialogue, that sort of surrogate dialogue to where like, there's people on this planet that think exactly like I do, that are interested in stuff like I do. That it's like, you go to your job and it's like, ain't no Prince fans there, cool people, but just ain't no Prince fans, or maybe you can talk about comics or comic book movies to a certain level, but that whole deep dive about who wrote what, who drew what, that type of thing. Like I said, there's cats on this planet still, thankfully, still walking this earth. And thankfully, I'm still walking this earth that, like I said, dynamics and time, and, maybe I need to clip some timelines or jump into some frequencies and manipulate pockets of time to change the paradigm to once again be able to either on a phone or face-to-face dialogue with some people about, like I said, music, movies, comics, whatever. to kind of be in that position. But definitely, John Snep was one of those to where when I was thinking about wanting to do a podcast of some sort or a show of some sort, that was one of the people like I could just watch and listen, take notes from, and try to be just as good. And it was a shock to lose that cat so early. So like I said, when it comes to doing the Batman episodes, those are the two reasons why I do a Batman episode every, third time in a row. Like I said, there's only so much Batman stuff to cover. And I think this pretty much capped it off. But again, until something comes to light, like I said, a Batman Super Deluxe or a vinyl reissue or something like that, then this is the one. The Batman, the Prince, the Batman, the comics, the funk. And yeah, I mean, like I say, a lot of people don't really take well to that album, but hey, I enjoy this album. Like I said, it's not, if there was a top 5 or top 10, maybe top 10, it would fit in my top 10 somewhere. But like I said, every time I play it, I enjoyed it. I played the hell out of it in 1989. Listening to Bat Dance, when that first dropped, because it was like an updated version of the TV show, and in a good way. Like I said, it didn't have any of the campiness, and it was clever because you had Bat Dance before you even, like a month or so before you even saw the movie, I think. But when you listen to it, and there's the samples from bits in the film, so you hear Michael Keaton, you hear Jack Nicholson, you hear Kim Basinger, and it's like, to hear that, and you go, oh, well, what scene is that going to be? Oh, I wonder how that scene's going to play out. I got to go to work, got to go to work. Like, what is that? He's out there right now. I've got to go to work. Like, oh, what that scene is going to be like. And, it was also clever, too, how he was able to just blend the sounds. Because, he knew this was going to be a universal hit. This was something that was going to grab everybody. It wasn't just going to grab just maybe the comic book sweaties. This was going to grab everybody. Because, the mainstream did at one point watch the Batman TV show. So they're going to go in with that curiosity factor. And to have it kind of start off and it's like this heavy industrial kind of rock kind of vibe. So that grabbed that crowd. But then it switches up and you get that little funk, and kind of like little sample funk. And to me, Prince doing hip hop, it should have been a thing to where Prince doing hip hop should have been Prince not doing hip hop. But the way he utilized the samples integrated with his musicianship in relationship to where he was still using drum machines and things of that nature. To me, that's Prince doing hip hop without really doing hip hop, or trying to, where it's Prince making something his own, and to where it just kind of stop the press. Who is that? Just having that in there, and it switches and becomes this sort of funky thing. Then, we're kind of like, oh, okay, Bad Day, yeah. I'm with it. Okay, and this is for the Batman movie? Okay, yeah, we're going to check for those again that aren't comic book sweaties. That's the funk. That's the thing that kind of drew us into it. And you get that throughout the album, the samples. And he was capturing the nature of duality. Where a lot of people were kind of just hating and saying, oh, he didn't understand the movie. And it's like, none of these songs make sense. It didn't go with the movie. Well, there was a lot of, again, that thing with what the studio wanted, the pressure on the director. Prince hands over this handful of songs, and it's like, will this work? Okay, I got to use this. I think there's a way, I don't know, you can repurpose that soundtrack at some point. There is a Flash movie, or movie with the superhero The Flash, that's going to have Michael Keaton sort of reprise his role as Bruce Wayne. Maybe he'll be in the Batman costume as well. In fact, actually, they did tease his costume kind of laying around and, it's dust covered and stuff like that. So it did tease that. And I'm like, I think they can repurpose that. I think it would be cool if they repurpose the Batman soundtrack or elements. I mean, if there's a way you can integrate Bat Dance, not make it to where it's where it looks silly or corny, but maybe utilize The Future or something like that, or utilize some of the other songs. Because to me, like Electric Chair, Vicky Waiting, they just kind of use the instrumental of it, which I get, because even that made it reminiscent of elements of the Batman TV show, where it just kind of plays underneath the soundtrack. That was fine, and I think you can repurpose that. You should repurpose that, because you bring it back Michael Keaton, you need something that will remind you of that. I know when it came to the subsequent Batman movies, to me the soundtracks never worked. I never bothered to want to listen to whoever. The track with Seal in Batman Forever, that was okay. That's maybe the closest, because it's a nicely written song, but it just wasn't Prince. And I just never bothered with Batman soundtracks after that, beyond the actual musical score of the film, which is different. The orchestral scores, that's different. Those I still enjoy, whether it's Danny Elfman or whether it's Hans Zimmer, or whether it's Junkie XL. But having, Prince, he kind of set that bar to where when you try to do the mainstream pop soundtrack, it just paled in comparison. And that was even with certain soundtracks across the board. I think really, to me, I didn't perk up at another movie soundtrack maybe until Boys in the Hood. And then maybe after that, Poetic Justice, Above the Rim. Yeah, but other than that, no. I did, everything else sort of kind of where, again, Prince set that standard where soundtracks for a while after the Batman soundtrack became this thing of music inspired by the film. So, half the songs weren't even in the movie anyway. Songs inspired by the film, blah, 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 blah. So when, people say he didn't get the film, I think he did. I think he perfectly captured the nature of duality with that album. Like if it wasn't a Batman soundtrack, then you could say it's Prince exploring his own duality. And I think that might have been one of the psychological things that he got into when putting that together. Like he understood the obsessively driven nature of Batman, and how even as far as that personal duality, where, Batman is the reality. That is the person. Bruce Wayne is actually the costume. Bruce Wayne is actually the mask, because the real Bruce Wayne really psychologically died when his parents were murdered in that alley. All sense, that young, all sense and innocence have just been taken, snatched away from your life. And that was when he ceased being innocent little Bruce Wayne. And really, Batman was born right then and there, to be so obsessively driven that your billions isn't enough to you to try to affect change. It's like, no, you want to punish every single criminal that walks the earth so no one else feels the pain that he felt. You know, that's duality, and again, like I said, reflection of Prince's own duality, to where it's like he's constantly driven to create music. And yeah, he wants to be loved and accepted and all these other things. But in order to be who he is, that allows him to create on a constant basis, to be that superstar, to maintain that privacy, to maintain that mystique. That's a duality, to not have people get too close, to discover the secret identity or whatever, that type of thing. The sort of Gemini dynamic, good versus evil, to where, yeah, Batman, Joker, two sides of the same coin, possibly, because they're both crazy. But one, there's sort of this dynamic that one doesn't live without the other. The Joker refuses, well, not necessarily in that movie. It didn't really illustrate that well, but more so maybe The Dark Knight, where it's this thing to where, hey, Joker doesn't dare kill Batman, or wouldn't allow anybody else to kill Batman, because that would just end Joker's reason for existing. Yeah, it's weird, it's psychological, and you need somebody with a psychology degree to really sort all of that out. But that's not this show. But again, as an artist assigned to do a job, to do a soundtrack, yeah, I think he got the movie very well. He understood the characters very well. It's a good story. To me, the movie still holds up. In fact, watched it just the night before, and it still holds up. Actually, a lot of those lines that are in that movie are actually relevant as inside jokes, or a way to just balance our own stress at the non-essentially or essentially non-essentially essential gig. So, hey, it works. It still holds up. And yeah, Michael Keaton is a favorite as the number one Batman, more so than Adam West to a lot of people. We thought back in the day when they cast Michael Keaton, we were like, oh, no, the dude from Mr. Mom. Oh, shit, the dude from Night Shift. Oh, hell, this is going to go right back to the Batman TV show. We're going to get the pow and the biff and the bam and to the Batmobile all over again. No. But the day we saw that trailer and we saw the costume, and the minute he grabbed the crook, it was like, I'm Batman. It's like, yep, that's Batman. That's Batman. There ain't no doubt about it. That's Batman. That's Batman. And, set the template for everybody else that came along afterwards. Val Kilmer did all right. George Clooney I was disappointed in, because I thought I was going to get Dusk Till Dawn, but in a Batman costume, and didn't get that, and I was disappointed. Christian Bale was good. He had a good Batman, had a good Bruce Wayne, just hated the voice. It's not who I am, it's what I do. Yeah. It's something simple as putting a coat on a little boy to assure him that the world, it could have been better, but Ben Affleck did good. He portrayed a comic book accurate Batman and Bruce Wayne to me, and that's just lost on people to just hate Ben Affleck. But as an actor, yeah, he captured the comic book persona of Batman and Bruce Wayne. It was just like the comic book come to life. And now we got to wait to see what Robert Pattinson's going to do now. But it's also good to see Michael Keaton come back to the role. And again, like I said, I hope they can just insert some Prince in there somewhere. It's Warner Brothers. They own the movie rights. They own the rights to the soundtrack. So go ahead, repurpose it. Go and make a few, make a few off of it. State gets a cut of that and repurpose it. It reintroduce a new generation of comic book sweaties to Prince and have them go back and go, oh, Prince did the soundtrack to the first Batman movie? I mean, like they didn't already know because there's Party Man and Trust in the first one. But really take a look at that album and really get into it. And yeah, there's some filler. But hey, the great John Rochester, I mean, he dug the track Lemon Crush, and to the point to where, I had to listen to it with a second pair of ears to where like, okay, well, I see what he gets out of it. And now when I play that song now, then it's like I remember what he got out of it. And then I'm able to enjoy it much better, because music is subjective. And sometimes when you do have those differences, sometimes you can just understand what the other person gets out of it. And even if you walk away from still not liking that song or not liking it even more than before that exchange, still you understand what that person gets out of it and you respect that person because it's like, okay, you see that track moves that person. You see that track has an effect on that person that, hey, may not be meant for you, but you get why other people dig it. So that's my case for the Batman soundtrack once again. Let me know your thoughts and comments on that album. Do you enjoy it as much as I do? I wish there was a lot more that was done for it. Ooh, more thunder. And, I wish there was more that was done for that. Like the performance on Saturday Night Live, the anniversary special, and Prince performed the electric chair. That's one of my favorite promotions. That was much later. The film and the album, it kind of wound down at that point. But still, to get that performance and have that preserved on video, the Party Man video, to me, which I like better than the Bat Dance video. But I mean, I appreciate the Bat Dance video for what it was. It was just a good lead-in promotion for the track, the album, and the film. But I, really enjoyed the Party Man video a lot. And like I said, the 12-inch singles, the B-sides, all of that. So like I said, I'm hoping that one day we'll get an expanded version. But is that something that you're looking forward to as well? Did it help give you a better appreciation for the Batman soundtrack? Or let me know your comments one way or the other. And that is going to end this episode of Amari Purple Talk. And as always, thank you once again for tuning in. Always a joy. Like I said, don't forget to look out for that Prince Twitter thread, Jill Jones album, later this month, starting June 28th. Keep supporting the show. All the links, the tip links, Amari merchandise. Go to the Cafe Press website. Buy some t-shirts, coffee mugs, whatever on that site catches your eye, and help keep this show going. 1, 2, 3. Also, like I said, working on trying to finish this comic. A few distractions this past week, but I'll start this week trying to bring that home. Because there's another one actually.
Is Amari Purple
this
Talk.
first project. There's another one I want to start on, which I'm going to start on regardless. But this first one will just probably end up being a little late. That's The Answer. But there's also t-shirts featuring that character. 2 different styles of t-shirts. Definitely pick one of those up as well. All those proceeds will help me get that book finished. Also, this other project I'm working on as well. Trying to set off my own little comic universe. And like I said, The Answer, who in his everyday guise as Eric Sterling, genius, billionaire, playboy, philanthropist. And how Tony Stark is listening to AC/DC while he's building his tech. Eric Sterling, he jammed some Prince while he's building his tech. So, and dropped a little Easter eggs and references, maybe a little album cover in the background or something like that too, just for you guys. So support all these projects. Thank you very much. And don't forget to tune in next week. And remember, be safe. Also create your day. And then go create your life. And as always, keep it purple and on the one.